Breathing, ventilation. This is a lot of, we're not going to look at, Boyle's Law, that's what it was. We're going to do a lot with respiration rate and breathing volume in lab today. So this is going to get more into the physiology or the lab side of things. The first half of the lecture was more anatomy type stuff. Before we get started, do you have any questions on anatomy? The Highland question was a good question. Any others? Our brains are all rested after yesterday afternoon, right?
That lab test is next Wednesday.
Let's check the calendar. I'm not sure. We're on our calendar, so whatever the calendar says, sometime next week. Yeah. Okay. Ventilation is movement of air in and out of the lungs. So breathing is ventilation. The air moves from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. Now, that's what I was talking about earlier. When you breathe in, you're really not forcefully pulling the air into your lungs. The air is going into your lungs because the air pressure outside in the air of the world is higher than the air pressure in your lungs. So the air is more being pushed into your lungs than you are pulling it. Physicists have this whole argument about whether a pull is actually a force. It's usually a push. Anyways, getting the air in and out of your lungs follows Boyle's Law. Boyle's Law is that the pressure equals some sort of constant divided by the volume, where the pressure is the gas pressure and the V is the volume, and the K changes depending on the different temperatures. And so the air pressure is going to change. If it's hot, the air expands, and if it's cold, the air contracts, and so that's going to affect kind of how much of a change in volume is required to change it to a certain pressure. So it's affected by temperature a little bit. Humans really only survive within a fairly narrow range of temperatures, so unlike a chemical reaction, so if you were a chemist and you were worried about this law, and you had a reaction chamber that was like literally the temperature of fire, and you had to worry about really hot temperatures, it really messes the air, it really changes things. But within human body compatible temperatures, it's not going to fluctuate quite that much. So if the barometric pressure, that means the pressure outside of your body, is greater than the alveolar pressure, then air flows into the lungs. And if the diaphragm contracts, the size of the alveoli increases, so their volume increases, so that decreases the pressure. So that's when the air flows in and out of the lungs. So as the alveoli get bigger, their volume increases, the pressure decreases, and the air goes in. As the alveoli get smaller, their volume decreases, so the pressure increases, so the air goes out. Okay. This is a picture of the same thing. And so you have 1, 2, 3, 4. And that size change, when they get smaller, that's helped by that elastic connective tissue that wraps around the alveoli, and also the diaphragm pushing up. When they get bigger, it's from the diaphragm pulling down, and the rib cage expanding.
Can you go back a slide?
Mm-hmm.
That last bullet.
Mm-hmm. If the diaphragm contracts, the size of the alveoli contracts. So when the diaphragm contracts, it pulls down.
Okay.
So when you breathe in, your diaphragm is contracting. And when you breathe out, your diaphragm is relaxing.
Okay.
Was that the confusing part?
But then also, I think it says when the diaphragm contracts, they increase, but then in that last sentence it says when the diaphragm contracts, the alveoli get smaller.
The P and the pressure gets smaller, not the volume.
Oh, okay.
Yep. So when the volume gets bigger, the pressure gets smaller.
Okay.
Yes, I'm glad you asked. That would have been confusing. So on this slide, V is volume and P is pressure. So this is going to be one of those confusing multiple choice questions, right? To figure out when one thing goes up and the other one goes down and what's going on and which way does the air move. So it's an inverse law. So when pressure goes up, volume goes down, or vice versa. When volume goes down, pressure goes up. If the container gets smaller, the air inside of it's going to be under bigger pressure. So multiple choice questions about those inverse relationships always are a little bit confusing. So just take your time on the test and think. I draw pictures. That's how I keep it straight in my brain. But I'm a picture person. Okay, so the lung recoil causes the alveoli to collapse, resulting from both of these things, elastic recoil and surface tension. So elastic recoil, so when the alveoli get smaller, it's because there's those elastic fibers on the outside of the air sacs, and they're always kind of constricting down, helping to expel the air out of the lungs by making the volume smaller. There's also surface tension. Remember, we're talking about like microscopic sized stuff, right? So have you seen pictures of those water strider bugs sitting on the water? Okay. So at a small scale, surface tension of water is a huge thing. And so in your lungs, it's not fluid filled. I mean, your lungs aren't swimming in water, but there's fluid on the inside of your lungs, right? The inside of your lungs is moist. So in those air sacs of your lungs, it's not a dry surface, it's a moist surface. And a big part of that moisture is water. And the water that makes up that moisture on the inside of your lungs exhibits surface tension. All of that water wants to find itself and form a little droplet. And so that's what a big part of surfactant does. Surfactant is a chemical relative to a lot of detergents. There's little science experiments you can do with elementary age kids, where if you take and put a paper clip on the surface of the water, if you're really careful about how you put it, you can float a paper clip on the surface of like some water in a bowl. But if you take a single drop of like Dawn dish detergent and put it on the paper clip, it breaks the surface tension and the paper clip will sink. So what the surfactant does is it breaks up that surface tension, a lot like a detergent would. And by breaking up that surface tension, it allows your lungs to be able to expand and inflate easier and not collapsing on themselves. Because that surface tension of the water, that water wants to gather together into a droplet. Water likes to adhere to itself. And so without that surface tension, it makes it a lot harder for your lungs to inflate because you're battling on a microscopic scale against thousands of tiny little water droplets that want to form and want to collapse those air sacs of your lungs.
The surfactant makes the water not able to bundle up.
It reduces the surface tension of the water, yes. It interferes with the hydrogen bonds because the surface tension is caused by hydrogen bonds between water molecules. So it reduces the effect of those hydrogen bonds.
Allowing a paper clip to sink, right?
A what?
Allowing a paper clip to sink.
Yes. Yes, that would allow the paper clip to sink. It makes it so water doesn't stick to itself as well as it would without the surfactant. There is something called respiratory distress syndrome or hyaline membrane disease, which is common in infants with a gestation age of less than 7 months. Basically, their lungs, their air sacs, it's not really, it's kind of a collapsed lung, but not the kind that we usually talk about. Their air sacs collapse. And so if you have an infant that's born before 7 months of gestation, it's harder, even once they get their lungs inflated, you have to keep supplying that surfactant until they can make it on their own. Otherwise, their little air sacs will collapse and they won't be able to breathe properly, so they have to be on a ventilator a lot. So normally, when you breathe, this graph is tracking the pleural pressure. So the pressure in the whole lung cavity. So you breathe in, and then you breathe out, and that's the pressure of like forcing the air out of your lungs. The intra-alveolar pressure is going to be at a peak, like in the middle of your exhalation, which is weird, right? So you would think that the pressure in your alveoli would be at the greatest when you're first starting to breathe out, but you need an actual greater pressure right here to force the leftover air out of your lungs. So some of the air in your lungs will leave just because they're full. And then when you actually have to and then there's not much left to push on. So as you breathe out, the pressure in your alveoli actually increases. This is what we usually think of. It's just a change in lung volume. So that's only volume, and it feels like you have the highest pressure right here, but you don't. Does that make sense? So if you go right now, my mouth and my throat and my nose is open, right? So if I go, it's equal pressure with the environment, right? So if I can stand here with my nose and my mouth open, with my lungs fully inflated, and no air is moving either direction, the pressure is going to be equal with the environment. Which is kind of weird, right? Because you think when your lungs are full that that's the highest pressure. But that's not necessarily the case. So when they're at their highest volume is really right here when your pleural pressure is at its lowest. Kind of odd. Compliance is, the root of that word is the same, it's used the same way when we talked about the compliance of your arteries. Remember when we talked about compliance in your arteries, it was how the ability of your arteries to expand and contract with every heartbeat. And so your elastic arteries show compliance because when your ventricles contract, they expand, and when your ventricles are relaxing, they decrease. Your lungs are the same way. So compliance is the measure of the ease with which the lungs and the thorax expand. And so when you tell your lungs to inflate by pulling down on your diaphragm and raising your ribs up, do your lungs comply and fill up like they're supposed to? The greater the compliance, the easier it is for a change in pressure to cause expansion. So if you don't have any scarring in your lungs and you don't have any like small tubes from asthma or something like that, you tell your lungs to inflate and they inflate. Great compliance. A lower than normal compliance means that the lungs and the thorax are harder to expand for some reason. It could be a lot of different reasons. Maybe you got into a car accident and you have bruised or cracked ribs. So when you try to breathe in, your rib cage kind of resists and it won't expand out the way that it's supposed to. It might be due to scarring in your lungs from multiple infections, like with cystic fibrosis, if you've had multiple pneumonia infections and it's caused scarring in your lungs. Or tuberculosis causes a buildup of little scar tissue in your lungs and it reduces the compliance of the lungs. So there's lots of different conditions and diseases that can decrease compliance. Pulmonary fibrosis is the deposition of inelastic fibers in the lungs, and that's what leads to emphysema. One of the main leading causes of emphysema is what?
Smoking.
Smoking, yes. But there's other things that can cause emphysema as well. We had a lady who taught PE, elementary PE. She used to teach down at Sunrise Elementary, which is down by the corn plant, and then we sold that off, and now it's their administrative offices. She has emphysema and she's never smoked a day in her life. And they don't know what caused her emphysema, but they're suspicious after being outside with elementary PE year after year after year after year after year with all of the particles in the air from the corn plant. When they ship the corn in there, it causes a lot of just crop dust in the air. And then they grind it up and that causes more dust. There's just a lot of particulate matter in the air around there. And she was outside working with the kids were there they have young lungs in the first place, and they were there for maybe 6 years, from kindergarten through 5th grade, and she was there for 20 or 30 years while she taught PE outside every day. And so they don't know that that was the case, but that was one of the main things that they were like, there's nothing else like in your history, you're not a smoker, you didn't work on a ship with asbestos, whatever. And so causing that scarring in her lungs, but she developed emphysema and had never smoked a day in her life. So if there's inelastic fibers, if there's those collagen fibers that get into your lungs, so they're not elastic, that it prevents their ability to expand and contract effectively.
My dad has emphysema. He was just diagnosed with it, and he smokes, but they said it's not from that; it's from secondhand smoke.
Oh. Was he around that more? Well, probably when he was younger, or
Probably.
I don't know. One more reason not to smoke around your kids.
Yep.
And caused by smoking, but it can be caused by other things as well. Just any exposure to anything that's going to cause deposit of inelastic fibers in your lungs, and then your lungs can't comply, so they can't inflate the way that they're supposed to. Pulmonary edema is a buildup of fluid in your lungs. So if the space in your lungs is being taken up by fluid, then they can't inflate with air. Respiratory distress syndrome goes back to the idea of your lungs not being able to inflate with the infant one was due to high cartilage and surfactant, but there's other causes for respiratory distress syndrome. Increased resistance to airflow caused by some sort of obstruction. So asthma, bronchitis, lung cancer, those can all decrease compliance. So with asthma, your little bronchioles into your lungs get smaller because the smooth muscle tissue constricts down. And so, like I said, it's trying to breathe through a coffee stirrer instead of a regular straw or a smoothie straw. And so you want to try to increase compliance by increasing the size of that airway. Bronchitis causes the same kind of inflammation as asthma, but it's due to the inflammation response of your immune system instead of the smooth muscle constriction of asthma. And then lung cancer, the tumor is going to put pressure and take up space that would otherwise be taken up by air in your lungs. And then kyphosis and scoliosis can also cause decreased compliance because it changes the shape of your thoracic cavity. And so if you have got a sideways curving spine or a hunched spine, that decreases the total volume that you can expand your chest out to. Which is, apart from cosmetic issues, there are real medical issues why you want to fix a kid's scoliosis or kyphosis. This is what we're going to do in lab today. So you might want to put like a little star by this and say lab. This isn't labeling, but these would be more like, tell me what's happening. Why is this person blah, 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 like the heart rate graph on the last lab test or something like this. So this is good lab questions as well as lecture questions. Measuring the volume of air that moves into and out of the lungs is called spirometry, and it uses a device called a spirometer, and we're going to use one of these in lab today. We'll use 3 of them actually. This is what ours look like. Also, if you've ever been to the hospital and you've had any sort of surgery, they give you that plastic thing that has 2 tubes in it, and you have to be able to push the little plastic floaty thing up to a certain level before they'll let you leave. And so, yeah, after you have a C-section and you have a kid, you have to blow into there, and like that's the only test. Then you get to take home this little like person and be responsible for it, just because you breathe hard enough.
Don't you inhale, not blow into it?
What?
Don't you suck air from it, not blow into it?
You can suck air in. It's been, 7 years today since I've had to do that. It's all fuzzy. You block it out. Yeah, so this is a spirometer. You can also use the one with the little flow chart on it. The tidal volumes, so you need to memorize these different volumes. They all define different aspects of your lungs. So on the test, on the lecture test, you need to be able to keep these different volumes straight and what they mean. And so this is just straight definitions. So put a little star by these to memorize their definitions for the test. The tidal volume is the amount of air either breathed in or breathed out with each breath. So it's not the total in and out, it's one or the other. And so when you're sitting there at rest, not lecturing or walking around or exercising or something, typically a breath in or a breath out is about half a liter. The inspiratory reserve volume is the amount that can be forcefully inspired after inspiration of the tidal volume. So if you're sitting there at rest, just breathing in and out, and then somebody's like, okay, now hold your breath, and you suck it in a little bit more, that's the inspiratory reserve volume. Usually it's about an additional 3 liters. So you're sitting there breathing in and breathing out. If you really want to forcefully breathe in and hold your breath, you can get it about another 3,000 milliliters. It's pretty significant. That's like a pop bottle and a half, right? The expiratory reserve volume is the amount that can be forcefully exhaled after exhaling the tidal volume. So that's, I think I might have a typo there by a 0. I need to double check that. That says 100 milliliters at rest, which seems really
It's
small. That's like
1100.
1100, I'm missing a 1 instead of a 0. Thank you. That doesn't look right.
So is that like when you're outside in the cold and you take that second, like, look at my breath? And you do
Yeah.
that, you can see it.
Yeah. Thank you. The residual volume is the amount of air that's still remaining in your respiratory passages and lungs after your most forceful expiration. So even when you breathe all the way out, there's still, your trachea doesn't collapse, right? So there's still air in your trachea, and your air sacs of your lungs should not go flat. That's that infant problem when they don't have enough surfactant. That would cause you make it really hard to actually breathe in again if your air sacs of your lungs went flat. And so you generally have a little bit over a liter of air that remains in your lungs and bronchioles and bronchi after you breathe out all that you can. You can't like fully deflate your lungs like a balloon. The pulmonary capacities are the sum of two or more of those pulmonary volumes. So put a star by these to memorize these as well. This is just straightforward memorization. You have to memorize these. The inspiratory capacity, I always say that wrong, sorry, is the tidal volume, so your normal breath, plus the inspiratory reserve volume. Okay, so your capacity to inspire is a normal breath plus the extra stuff that you suck in. Make sense? Your functional residual capacity is the expiratory reserve plus the residual volume. Okay, so look back here. Expiratory reserve, the extra stuff that you can breathe out, plus the residual volume, whatever you have left.
Those amounts are the same for everyone.
No, it's going to change depending on your age and your size and your general physical health. So like somebody with tuberculosis, this is for an average healthy person, healthy adult. For a little tiny baby, that's going to be smaller.
So you're not going to ask us to like
No.
figure that out? Okay.
The vital capacity is the sum of the inspiratory reserve, so the extra that you can suck in, plus your tidal volume, a normal breath, and the expiratory reserve volume. So the extra that you can suck in, a normal breath, and the extra that you can blow out. So your vital capacity is how much air can you suck into your lungs and then blow completely out. So it's a normal breath plus all of the extra on each side. Your vital capacity is how much air can you move in and out of your lung during a forceful inspiration and expiration. And then your total lung capacity includes the air that never leaves your lungs. So it's your vital capacity plus the stuff that always stays there. The stuff that's always in your lungs that you can't breathe out. Make sense? Okay. I mean, if you didn't understand, I could go over it again, but otherwise you probably don't have it memorized yet, but those last slide and this slide, you just need to memorize those. There's going to be questions about those. So, if you were using a spirometer, this is what this graph might look like. If you're normally sitting there at rest, this would be your tidal volume, right? And then you take this big, huge breath in. So from here to here, that's your inspiratory reserve. You good? And then you're at your normal tidal volume. So we're not talking about from your biggest breath in to your biggest exhale. Your maximum expiration, your expiratory reserve, is just when you're breathing normally off of a tidal volume. So the amount that you can force out is actually less than the amount that you can force in. Okay? So here's your expiratory reserve. And then your total lung capacity is from your biggest breath in to your biggest breath out, this difference right here. So you can see that on the graph right here, that's your total lung capacity. And then if you include this stuff, your residual volume that never exits, or it's not the exact same air molecules, but a volume of air molecules that's always in your trachea, bronchioles, and air sacs. That's your residual volume. And the actual air molecules will shift around and fluctuate, but the volume is going to remain relatively constant around 1,200 milliliters, a little over a liter. And that's for an average-sized healthy adult. Obviously, if you're a small, petite person, like, I can think of this junior high teacher that we had, she's like 5 feet tall in heels. Okay, and she's just this tiny little person. She's going to have a smaller volume overall because she's going to have smaller lungs.
We should know the average number.
Just the average numbers are fine.
The one that's on the slide.
Yes, the ones up on the slides. So if we do lab and yours is different, things like being pregnant can change your inspiratory and expiratory reserve because the baby crowds up in there and you just can't take as deep of a breath, so your respiration rate increases. Not enough room for anything. Let's see. So your vital capacity is from here to here. Your total lung capacity includes that extra that never leaves.
So the whole thing is total.
Yeah, sorry, I might have misspoke earlier. The total thing right here is total lung capacity. That includes the residual that never leaves. The vital capacity is from your biggest breath in to your biggest breath out. And we're going to do that in lab today. These are things we're going to do in lab today too. We're going to test your minute ventilation and your respiratory rate. We're not going to do the dead space. That's part of the residual. But your minute ventilation is the total air moved in and out of your respiratory system each minute. That's the tidal volume times the respiratory rate. So if you figure out that your tidal volume is maybe 450 milliliters instead of 500, and you have a respiration rate of 40 breaths per minute, you would take 40 times 450, and that would be your minute ventilation, how much air you move in a minute. That's a lot of liters of air that you're moving every minute. Your respiratory rate, or your respiratory frequency, is just the number of breaths that you take per minute. It's a little bit harder to measure than pulse rate. It can be useful to know, but people can control their respiratory rate a lot easier than they can control their heart rate. So if somebody is aware that they're being watched, that's going to change their respiration rate. If somebody is, if somebody's taking shallow breaths, it's not as easy to see their respiration rate as it is to take their pulse. And so there's different things that you can do in a lab setting in order to keep track of that. You can put like a respiration monitor on and it kind of keeps track, but they're kind of tricky to use. You can put like a necklace or some sort of object on their chest so it's easier to see the rise and fall of their chest, but mostly you have to kind of look at their shoulders and look at their chest and watch it rise and fall. You're going to be responsible for doing that today for your partner, so just be observant. The anatomic dead space is formed by the nasal cavity, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and the terminal bronchioles. So the dead space is the part that doesn't really help you breathe. Like your nose, your nasal cavity doesn't expand and contract, right? So if I'm sitting here in class, is there air in my nose? Yes, but is it helping me get air in and out of my body? No. So it's the anatomic dead space. The physiological dead space is the anatomic dead space plus the volume of the alveoli in which gas exchange is less than normal. And so if you have some alveoli that really aren't working very hard, like you're not always filling all of the lobes of your lungs, when you have those deep breaths, so when you go to the hospital and they do make you have that forceful breath of air out, it's easier to not empty the bottoms of your lungs. You have to kind of forcefully push that air out. It's just going to exchange with the top of your lungs easier. And so forcing you to take those, when the respiratory therapist comes by and forces you to take those big deep breaths in and deep breaths out, they're really trying to decrease that physiological dead space, because then you can end up with edema and other bad issues in the far reaches of your lungs. The alveolar ventilation, which is V sub A, is the volume, remember V is volume, right? So luckily ventilation also starts with a V, so it doesn't make things a little bit more complicated. It's the volume of air that's available for gas exchange per minute. So if you have a slow respiration rate and a low tidal volume, that's going to decrease your V sub A. You're not exchanging that much air through your lungs in a minute. Okay, we're going to get into a little bit of physics. I'm sorry, but it's a little bit necessary. Some people in this class might go on into respiratory therapy or work at a respiratory therapist's office. So, partial pressure is controlled by a physics idea called Dalton's law. I know you just love all the physics that we have in this chapter, right? Yay, physics. The partial pressure is the pressure exerted by each type of gas in a mixture. So, how many of you have been to the mountains, like the Rocky Mountains, or some other tall mountains? Okay, is it harder to breathe?
Yes.
Okay, why? It seems harder to breathe. It's not really that much harder to get the air in and out of your lungs, but do your lungs end up working harder? Okay, why? Is there less oxygen in the air?
Just a higher pressure.
Higher? It's a higher altitude,
Lower pressure.
which is a lower pressure. And so when you go up into the mountains, the partial pressure of oxygen remains the same. Like the air is still 20% oxygen, right? And so if you look at the total supply of oxygen in the air, and you say, okay, this is all of the pressure of air pressure that you have going into your lungs, oxygen's portion of that stays the same, right? But when you breathe in a lungful of air that's 20% oxygen, that actually represents fewer molecules of oxygen because the air is less dense. There's less molecules per liter of air. So at sea level, when you take in a lungful of air, let's say you'd be getting in 20, this is way low, but 20 molecules of oxygen hitting the surfaces of your lungs. It's actually that times like many, many zeros. Up in the mountains at a high elevation where you have a lower pressure overall, the portion of that air pressure that's due to oxygen remains the same, but you're just taking fewer molecules into your lungs with each breath. And so there's less of a chance for that oxygen to diffuse across the membranes because there's just less molecules there overall. But Dalton's law says that the total pressure is the sum of all the individual pressures of each gas. So when you breathe in a lungful of air, it is oxygen molecules, but it's also nitrogen molecules, water vapor, carbon dioxide. There's this, like less than 1% of the air is carbon dioxide, so you're breathing that in as well. So you just add all those up, and that's the total pressure. Air in the respiratory system contains humidity because of the mucus lining system. So the partial pressure of water vapor in your lungs is actually greater than the partial pressure out in the air, even when it's really humid outside. It's really humid in your lungs as well. To get those gases that you want, like getting the oxygen into your blood and getting the carbon dioxide out into your lungs, that has to follow Henry's law. So Dalton's law is partial pressure. It has to do with the sum of all the different pressures. Henry's law says that the concentration of a gas in a liquid is determined by its partial pressure and its solubility. And so the ability of a gas to be concentrated in a liquid, like your blood or the mucus linings of your lungs, part of that is influenced by the partial pressure. And so when you have somebody in the hospital and you put them on oxygen, do you usually put them on 100% oxygen? No, that's really high. That's probably actually going to damage some tissues. And so when you put somebody on oxygen, though, it's a mixture of oxygen and other gases. because you're trying to increase that partial pressure of oxygen. So normal in atmospheric air, the partial pressure of oxygen makes up 20% of the total. And when you put them on oxygen in the hospital, you might ramp that up to 30 or 40% of the total pressure. Does that make sense? Somebody asked me to put somebody on 100% oxygen and actually damage their tissues more than help them. It's going to be a really extreme case. You also have to look at its solubility coefficient. Some gases dissolve in liquids a lot more easily than others. Okay, so getting gas back and forth across the membranes of your blood involves understanding those physical properties of gas exchange. So the thicker the membrane is, the lower the diffusion rate is going to be. So if there's something like an infection building up the thickness of that membrane, so you have like a bunch of like crud in your lungs, dead bacteria and white blood cells, and it's building up like a thicker, or you have a mucus response and you have a thick mucus in your lungs, like for cystic fibrosis, and it's going to build up the thickness of that membrane. And a thicker lining is going to mean that it's going to take longer for those gases to be able to diffuse across. Carbon dioxide with a diffusion coefficient, like how well it can diffuse, carbon dioxide is 20 times more diffusible than oxygen. So if you look at it diffusing across a membrane, carbon dioxide can diffuse a lot more quickly than oxygen can. Which is great because you want to get that carbon dioxide out of your blood, right? So it can diffuse out rather quickly. And the oxygen in the air has a higher partial pressure than carbon dioxide, so it shouldn't have that hard of a time getting diffused in. The surface area of diseases like emphysema and lung cancer are going to reduce the available surface area that you have going on the inside of your lungs. And so if you have all the surface area that you need, it's going to be a lot easier for that diffusion to take place. Also, infants versus adults. Infants, we generally talk about them having a large surface area compared to their body size when they lose heat from their skin. But infants with little tiny lungs have less surface area. They have smaller lungs, so they have less surface area than an adult's lungs do. And so if you look at the impact of something like whooping cough on an infant has less surface area in their lungs. And so if they get an infection like pneumonia or whooping cough, it's going to decrease their capacity to absorb oxygen a lot quicker. And so being sick in a baby in the respiratory system is a lot more serious than an adult with the same illness, unless that adult has other issues like emphysema. Partial pressure differences. Gases move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Normally the partial pressure of oxygen is higher in the alveoli than the blood. The opposite is usually true for carbon dioxide. So the oxygen is going to diffuse into the blood and the carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out just because that's where their concentrations are built up. So you can think of a pressure gradient a lot like a concentration gradient. Okay, the relationship between alveolar ventilation and actual pulmonary capillary perfusion. So the getting across into the ventilating your alveoli versus oxygenating your capillaries. Increased ventilation, so breathing faster, or increased pulmonary capillary blood flow increases the gas exchange. So if you want to get a lot of oxygen into your blood, let's say you're exercising, right, and your muscles are demanding more oxygen, you want to increase your respiration rate, but as a part of that sympathetic nervous system, you also want to increase blood flow to those air sacs of your lungs. If you just breathe faster, you're going to reach that maximum capacity for diffusion pretty quickly. But if you increase the blood flow to those capillaries, you're increasing the chances that diffusion can happen. So both of them have to, and you don't think about capillary perfusion rates very often. Shunted blood indicates blood that was not completely oxygenated. So if you're laying there asleep at night and you're not really working out or doing anything, you're sitting on the couch watching TV, and it's not a scary movie, your body doesn't really need your lungs to be at full capacity. You really don't need all of your blood fully oxygenated to sit on the couch. And so you're going to take those smooth muscles at the beginning of those capillary beds And remember those little sphincter muscles that shut off blood flow to the capillaries? And it just goes on the direct route instead of the meandering route. So if you shunt that blood, you're gonna send blood from your lungs back to your left atrium that is not fully oxygenated. Because the blood didn't spend very long in the lungs, in those capillaries. And that's okay. You don't need your blood to be at 100% oxygen saturation just to let you sit on the couch or breathe at night. You're getting enough oxygen to your tissues. But if you start exercising or walking around, or your heart starts beating faster because it's a scary movie, you have that stress response, that's going to relax those muscles that lead to the capillaries, and it's going to more fully permeate that. The blood is going to be all over that capillary bed and all the little side channels, and it's going to spend a little bit more time there and pick up more oxygen. So that's that perfusion rate. Let's see. So a low partial pressure of oxygen causes the arterioles to constrict so that the blood is shunted to a region of the lung where the alveoli are better ventilated. In other tissues of the body, a low partial pressure of oxygen causes the arterioles to dilate to deliver more blood to the tissues. So basically, your body keeps track of the partial pressure of oxygen, and if it drops, it sends the blood to other areas of the lungs that have a better oxygen supply, or it's going to send more, it's going to make the blood hang out in your muscle tissues longer. Okay, oxygen is going to move from the alveoli into the blood, and the blood is almost completely saturated with oxygen when it leaves that capillary. The partial pressure of oxygen in the blood decreases because of mixing with deoxygenated blood, like in that part of the lungs that just goes right back to the heart after it's been used up, and the oxygen from the tissue capillaries into the tissues. And so it's going to, basically this is saying your blood is going to pick up oxygen in the lungs and drop it off in the tissues. A fancy way of saying that. And carbon dioxide is going to move from the tissues back into the blood, and then from the blood into the alveoli. So we've talked about this a lot throughout the class, but this is just kind of setting it in words. So overall, remember, red is oxygenated, blue is deoxygenated, even though that's not really that color. So it's going to come from your heart and from the heart, I don't know, the ventricle, that bothers me, into the lungs, where it's going to pick up oxygen from the alveoli and drop off carbon dioxide. It's going to bring the oxygenated blood back to the left side of your heart, where it's going to go out to your tissues. It's going to drop off oxygen and pick up carbon dioxide. And these are just showing all the, you don't need to memorize all the different little partial pressures. I'm not going to place you over those. Or test. Sometimes we talk about shifting the curve when we're talking about respiration rates and oxygen saturation points. So when you look in here, this is looking at the partial pressures. This is what it used to be before the shift, and then the partial oxygen in the tissue. And the curve is going to shift to the right for the partial pressure of oxygen as the pH goes down and the carbon dioxide goes up or the temperature goes up. And so if you're shifting this to the right, it's going to cause more oxygen to permeate your tissues because you're high on carbon dioxide, so you want to shift the curve and increase the partial pressure of oxygen. Over here, if the pH goes up, so it becomes more basic, that means that you're losing carbon dioxide. That's going to shift the curve to the left, and it's going to cause the partial pressure of oxygen to decrease because you have plenty. So I guess what I want you to remember off of here is if you're short on oxygen, it's going to shift the curve to the right, and if you're high on oxygen, it's going to shift the curve to the left. If you're short on oxygen, you want to increase your oxygen, and if you have plenty of oxygen, you want to decrease your oxygen saturation. We talked about this a little bit with the circulatory system, or the blood. We talked about hemoglobin. But fetuses, before they are born, they make a special kind of hemoglobin that actually has a higher affinity for oxygen than the mom's hemoglobin does. So we're going to get into that in a little bit more detail here. A couple of reasons. The concentration of hemoglobin in the fetus is 50% greater than the concentration in the mom. So the hemoglobin is packed into those red blood cells tighter. So whereas a mom's hemoglobin probably is 1/3 of her total volume of her red blood cells, the fetus's is 50% more than that. So like 3/6, so like 50% instead of 1/3 of the total volume of the inside of the blood cell. The oxygen hemoglobin dissociation of the fetal hemoglobin is left of maternal. Okay, so that's the curve that we just looked at. That means that the fetus can bind oxygen better than the mom can. Their oxygen saturation curve is shifted to the left. They're going to bind oxygen better. BPG is a hormone that we didn't really talk about, so don't worry about what it is. But it doesn't really bother fetal hemoglobin. In adults, there's a hormone that causes the hemoglobin to release oxygen easier, and in the fetus, that hormone has little to no effect. So the fetus is going to hang on to its oxygen. Movement of carbon dioxide out of the fetal blood supply causes the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve to shift to the left again, so that's going to keep the oxygen. At the same time, movement of carbon dioxide into the mom's blood causes the shift to the right, and it's going to double up the effect of keeping the oxygen or getting rid of it. And so there's all kinds of ways that your kids mess with your body, even before they're born, basically. Getting carbon dioxide around, we talked about this with your blood as well. Some of that carbon dioxide binds to the globin in your hemoglobin, the protein portion. Most of it actually hitches a ride by being dissolved in the plasma of your blood as a bicarbonate ion. So it's not really dissolved carbon dioxide, it's carbon dioxide that hooks up with your buffer system and it gets shifted around. It's dissolved, but not as dissolved carbon dioxide. It's dissolved as a bicarbonate ion. So it hooks up with the bicarbonate. There's only about 7% of your total carbon dioxide that's dissolved as a gas in your blood plasma. Hemoglobin that has released oxygen is able to bind more effectively with carbon dioxide than hemoglobin that has oxygen down to it. All that's saying is that when your blood gets out to your tissues and it drops off the oxygen, it has a better capacity to be able to pick up carbon dioxide. So if your tissues are saturated with oxygen, probably means they're not producing a lot of carbon dioxide, so you're not going to take the carbon dioxide away because you're not going to be dropping oxygen off because your tissues already have plenty of oxygen. What that's going to result in is that you drop off the oxygen where it's needed. So if there's tissue that has plenty of oxygen in it, your blood will just go right on by and it won't pick up carbon dioxide or drop off oxygen. But when it gets to an oxygen poor area in your body, then it'll be dropping off the oxygen and will be better able to pick up carbon dioxide. In the capillaries of the tissue of your body, the carbon dioxide is going to combine with the water inside the red blood cells to form carbonic acid, which dissociates to form bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. Those hydrogen ions are what's going to decrease the pH of your blood and form an acid. So, in a picture, here's your tissue, here's your capillary, here's the red blood cells. The carbon dioxide generally leaves the tissues, it's picked up by the red blood cells and converted into bicarbonate. That has an exchange with the plasma, with the chloride concentration and the negative version of the bicarbonate. The hydrogen ions are going to bind with the hemoglobin and make it more ready to give off its oxygen. External respiration, so when you get back to the lungs, the buildup of carbon dioxide is going to be high in your blood by the time that you've been all the way through all the tissues of your body. So that's going to be more likely to diffuse out. Remember, it has a high diffusion rate, a high permeability rate. And then the oxygen is going to diffuse in and bind to the hemoglobin. It's going to kick off the hydrogen, make the carbon dioxide, and it's going to go out. Regulating how quickly you breathe is both conscious and subconscious. So luckily for us, we can swim because we're able to hold our breath. We cannot hold our heart rate like we can hold our breath. But when you're unconscious, like when you are sleeping, your body still goes ahead and breathes. Or like I said before, you can't hold your breath to death. And so your brain is smarter than you. You can have a temper tantrum if you're a little kid and try to hold your breath to get what you want, but once you pass out, your brainstem will say, hey stupid, you need to breathe, and it'll make you breathe again. So your breathing is under control by both your autonomic and your somatic nervous systems. It's both conscious and subconscious. But your general, when you don't have to think about it, kind of respiration rate is controlled by the respiratory center in your medulla oblongata. The dorsal groups stimulate the diaphragm, the ventral groups stimulate the intercostal and abdominal muscles, but all right here within your brainstem, in the medulla oblongata and a little bit in the pons. Those are the main autonomic centers that control your respiration rate, so you don't have to think about it all the time. You can hold your breath if you want. It'll make it convenient for lab today, but your body will also take over and just do it for you. With rhythmic ventilation, when you have a nice, even rhythm to your breathing, it can be shallow breathing when you're resting, or it can be deep breathing when you're exercising, but it gets a rhythm to it. Starting the inspiration is controlled by the respiratory center and the medulla oblongata. Those are continuously active. That center receives stimulation from oxygen sensors and acidity sensors to look at the acidity in your blood. And it has stimulations from the parts of the brain that are concerned with voluntary respiratory movements and emotion. So you can also breathe faster if you're upset, or slower if you're calm. Combined input from all of those sources causes action potentials that actually stimulates your respiratory muscles. Remember, you have to have a nerve signal to tell your muscles when to go, whether they're smooth or skeletal. So the action potential is generated up there in the brainstem, and it tells your breathing muscles, your diaphragm, and your intercostals when to go. To increase your respiration rate, so if the pH stays low or if the oxygen concentrations stay low, more and more neurons are going to be activated. So you're going to recruit more neurons, and they're going to send signals to more and more of your respiratory muscles to either breathe deeper or breathe more frequently. Stopping your breathing in. So think about it like you're breathing in, and you reach a point when you're not trying to do that forceful, if you just have your tidal volume, you don't always breathe into your fullest, right? And so there's a point where your brain says, okay, that's good enough, and then you stop breathing in. The neurons stimulating the breathing in are also responsible for stopping breathing in. And they receive input from something called the pontine group and stretch receptors in the lungs. So if you're sitting there at rest in your normal tidal volume, where you're not doing your maximum inspiration, there's stretch receptors and other receptors that tell you, hey, your lungs are full enough, and they stop that inspiration. And then the elastic recoil of your lungs and the relaxation of your diaphragm accomplishes that expiration. Problems with rhythmic ventilation include apnea and hyperventilation. So have you guys heard of sleep apnea? Okay. Apnea is just the cessation of breathing. So when you hold your breath, technically that's apnea, which is why they call the sleep study thing sleep apnea. So sleep apnea is not supposed to happen. But if you want to choose to hold your breath because you're diving underwater or because something stinks, that is apnea. But it's apnea that's under your conscious control. So it can be a conscious decision, but eventually the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is going to increase to a point that the respiratory center is going to override it. This is when you're smarter, that your brain is smarter than you. So you can try to hold your breath, but eventually when the carbon dioxide builds up to a certain level, it's going to force you to take your breath. You get that burning sensation in your lungs. Hyperventilation is breathing really, really quickly. So if you're freaking out about something, if you're having an anxiety attack and you're, or you're whatever, it's going to cause a decrease in your blood carbon dioxide levels. And this is going to be important. I want you to remember this when we get to the kidney chapter. It has to do with some stuff in the kidneys as well, which is weird. But if you breathe a lot, you're going to be giving up a lot of carbon dioxide, right? And carbon dioxide makes your blood acidic. So what's going to happen to the pH of your blood? It's going to go up, which is more basic, okay? And that's going to cause peripheral vasodilation. So if you dilate the blood vessels in your periphery, that's going to increase the overall volume of your blood vessels. So if you increase the volume, what happens to the pressure? It decreases. That's going to bring your blood pressure down, and that can cause fainting. So if somebody's having an anxiety attack and they're hyperventilating, can they faint from that?
Yes.
Okay. This can be a problem if you get professional divers. Sometimes when people who don't know what they're doing, they try to do a deep dive, they'll breathe in. Professional divers who free dive on their own and they dive really, really deep, they will hyperventilate on purpose before they dive because it decreases the carbon dioxide concentration in their blood and it super saturates their blood with oxygen. So they'll get all the carbon dioxide out of their system so they have longer before this carbon dioxide warning bell goes off so they can dive deeper and hold their breath for longer. But if you don't know what you're doing, I'm getting kind of lightheaded just demonstrating it. If you hyperventilate and then you try to dive right away and then you're underwater and you faint, is that good? No, okay, which is why you don't want to try to free deep dive, just, oh, I'm on vacation in the Bahamas, I can do it like them, and you do what you see them do, and then people have problems with drowning, because they faint underwater, which is a bad idea. Don't faint underwater. Because of the combination between your cerebellum and your limbic system, like I said before, respiration can be voluntarily and involuntarily controlled, and it can be controlled by emotions as well, like the anxiety. Carbon dioxide really is the major regulator of your respiration rate. It's really even more important than your oxygen levels. And so because the carbon dioxide concentration can change the pH of your blood, you have really good sensors that pick up on the pH in your blood. An increase or decrease in the pH can stimulate chemosensitive areas, and that can cause a greater rate and depth of respiration. So when your blood becomes more acidic, that means you're high on carbon dioxide and probably low on oxygen, so you need to pick up the depth and the rate of your breathing. There are other metabolic problems that we're going to get to, though, that can also increase the acidity of your blood. Ketoacidosis is one of them. So if you have some kidney problems that increase the acidity of your blood, it can artificially increase your respiration rate. So it's kind of like shock. It's one of those side effects that kind of goes out of control because our bodies are out of whack. Oxygen levels in your blood affect respiration when there's a 50% or greater decrease from normal levels. So your body picks up on minuscule changes in carbon dioxide levels, but you have to have a pretty big change in oxygen levels, a 50% change, in order to actually have oxygen levels affect your respiration rate. This one usually kicks in first. Let's see. Those chemoreceptors that we talked about, the chemical receptors, they respond to changes of chemicals in solution. The central ones are in chemical sensitive areas of your brain, including your medulla oblongata. Those are connected directly to your respiratory system, just like in the picture that we just saw. There's also peripheral chemoreceptors that pick up on your pH levels in the carotid artery and the aortic bodies. So in your aortic arch and your carotid arteries, it picks up on acidic levels, and that can affect your respiration rate. Let's see. I talked about that. Low pH, higher respiration. I'm repeating myself. So again, small changes in carbon dioxide can lead to changes in pH. Small changes in pH can have big changes on your respiration rate. Hypercapnia is greater than normal amount of carbon dioxide, and hypocapnia is lower than normal carbon dioxide. So hypercapnia, high CO2, greater respiration. Hypocapnia, lower than normal carbon dioxide, which is going to decrease your respiration rate. Let's see. Carbon dioxide and pH are more important than oxygen saturation. The carotid bodies really pick up on the changes in carbon dioxide due to exercise. And so when you start to build up the carbon dioxide and you can't get it out of your body fast enough, it'll increase your respiration rate in your exercise. The effect of oxygen is a little bit less pronounced and it takes longer to show up. But there's a direct sensor for the partial pressure of oxygen in your respiratory center in your medulla oblongata. If you have hypoxia, like hyperoxia, it's a high, hypoxia is low, hypothermia. Hypoxia is a decrease in the oxygen levels below normal values. Like if you're holding your breath, or if you're drowning and your oxygen levels go low, it's hypoxia and you have low oxygen concentration. You can also get this from carbon monoxide poisoning. You'll see the effects of hypoxia.
What about altitude?
Altitude sickness, some people are really sensitive to that change in altitude. It's caused more by the decreased density of the air. So you can't get, it's not the partial pressure of oxygen, you just have less oxygen overall. You can really feel ill when you get altitude sickness, and it's hard to tell who's going to have it and who's not. One of my teachers in my master's degree is very fit, very physically active lady, and she went up into the mountains and just got sick and was like sick to her stomach and had a headache, and it took her about a day or two to acclimate before she felt better.
After 6, you're supposed to like just start feeling sick, you're supposed to descend. And it's like supposed to descend. So you have this altitude, so I think it's like it starts 5,000 something. So when you go over 5,000, you get like the 7,000 level, you start to feel it, you drop back down to altitude. You try to activate and eat each other up. You're not supposed to drink a lot of water or eat a lot of food as well.
Yeah, well, because if you get sick, you're just going to be throwing up more. It's kind of like avoiding eating when you go on a boat, you know, if you're going to get seasick. But yeah, so the people who climb Mount Everest, they have those different base camps, and they'll spend a while at different altitudes of base camps so that they can acclimate. Gives their body they'll spend like a week at a certain base camp to give their body a chance to build up that hemoglobin and to acclimate to that different partial pressure before they'll hike up for the next few thousand feet. And so that's why it can take a month, you know, in total from the time that you start until you're back down to climb. It doesn't take that long to actually climb Mount Everest, but you have to stop and you have to wait and you have to acclimate before you go up any further. And still, most climbers, by the time that they get to the top of Mount Everest, have to have oxygen tanks because the total density of the air isn't enough to deliver enough oxygen to your lungs to be able to be coherent. There's a guy from Nebraska that just climbed Mount Everest this summer. It was like wasn't his first attempt. I think it was his third, fourth, or fifth attempt. It might have been his fifth. And he actually got all the way to the top. They didn't think they were going to be able to make it for weather. And he made it to the top and then got sick on the way back down, not because descending made him sick, but just that those effects of being at that high altitude caught up with him, and some of his co-climbers had to like help drag him back down the mountain, and he almost died. So it was interesting. The Herring-Brewer reflex limits the degree of inspiration and prevents the overinflation of the lungs. You don't want to like pop your air sacs in your lungs. You don't want to overinflate them, so you have a reflex that prevents you from doing that. In infants, that reflex plays a role in regulating the basic rhythm of breathing and preventing overinflation of the lungs. And in adults, that reflex is really only important when the tidal volume is large, like when you're exercising. And so when you have your normal inspiration and expiration rate, you don't want to like overinflate your lungs when you're taking a deep breath in, so. But for infants, it plays a big, big part in their regular, normal, everyday breathing. When you exercise, it makes you breathe faster. Slide done. No. Your respiration rate, your ventilation increases abruptly right when you first start exercising. The movement of the limbs actually has a strong influence on that. So when they teach proper form in athletic camps and stuff, and they teach you about the way that you're supposed to move your arms and your legs when you run, that has a lot to do with helping your body achieve its maximum respiration rate as well. And so it's not just avoiding injuries, like moving your body but properly when you exercise actually helps you breathe better.
Isn't it too, like when you're running, if you swing your arms in front of you like this, like you say you don't know what you're doing, and you're swinging your arms like this, it actually makes you breathe harder than you need to, which makes it harder to breathe.
I don't know, I would think that would kind of push in on your rib cage and prevent the expansion of the muscles on that side as well, so you're not getting the great volume that you want to be able to be getting.
They're always saying, fill your diaphragm. Fill
You
your
gotta breathe down, yeah, do that. When you do yoga, they teach you belly breathing, and that has a calming influence because of your vagus nerve. And there's also a learned component, and so because your breathing is voluntary and involuntary, practice and practicing the way that you're gonna breathe and how much, if you're racing, what your breathing is gonna be like at a certain point in the race, and if you want to forcefully, force that air out when you're trying to do something, or if you watch weightlifters and how they breathe when they're lifting and trying to get their maximum lift and stuff like that. There's a learned component to that as well. And it can be that memory learning too, like it's kind of like riding a bike, so your body learns how to do that and then you're more effective at your breathing. After the immediate increase in ventilation, you do have a gradual increase that occurs over the pace of about 4 to 6 minutes. So your breathing rate will kick up right away, and then it will continue to increase in depth and rate over the first about 4 to 6 minutes. Eventually you reach something called the anaerobic threshold, the highest level of exercise without causing a significant level in your blood pH. If you exceed that, then you end up, it's basically, there's a limit to how deep and how fast you can breathe without hyperventilating and making yourself faint. And so if you reach the maximum exercise tidal volume at the maximum rate, so you're breathing in and out as fast as you can, as deep as you can't increase that anymore. And so that's your maximum oxygen exchange. And if that's still not enough, then your body's going to switch over to lactic acid fermentation and you'll have sore muscles. Other things that can modify ventilation, the activation of touch, thermal, and pain receptors affects the respiratory center. So if you get hot, you're going to breathe faster. If there's different touch things, like when somebody blows on the back of your neck and it kind of gives you the heebie-jeebies, that increases your respiration rate. There's also calming. Pain receptors, when you're in pain, you're going to breathe faster. It's part of the pain response. You have the sneeze reflex and the cough reflex that makes that air go forcefully out of your nose or your mouth. If you're choking, or if you have an infection, or if you just have something itching your nose, you forcefully expel stuff. Usually I try to get foreign objects out. And being hot makes your respiration rate go up. Mostly because it makes your heart rate go up as well. So those two go hand in hand. Being able to adapt to exercise with athletic training, your vital capacity, so the total amount in and out, the biggest breath in to the biggest breath out, your vital capacity is going to be able to increase slightly. And so through training, you can kind of increase the amount that your sternum comes forward and your ribs come up, and your whole volume that you breathe in and breathe out can increase. The residual volume is also going to decrease slightly, so that dead space air at the bottom of your lungs, you're going to more forcefully get rid of more of the air in your lungs with more training. At maximal exercise, your tidal volume and your minute ventilation increases. And so with athletic training, because each breath is going to be bigger and you can also exchange that air faster, the total amount of air that you exchange in a minute is going to be higher. and that's going to allow you to oxygenate your blood faster. The gas exchange between the alveoli and the blood is going to increase at maximal exercise, so those membranes are going to go to the point where you can get the oxygen and carbon dioxide exchanged more effectively. Ventilation to your alveoli increases. That increased efficiency leads to greater blood flow through the lungs. And so by having that whole system be more efficient, you're going to be able to pump more blood through your lungs and oxygenate it quicker. So being in a good condition, being conditioned for a sport is going to allow you to exchange oxygen, carbon dioxide quicker, so you're going to run out of breath less often or after a longer race, which means less sore muscles. The opposite of the effects of exercise would be the effects of aging. This is the bad news. Even if you stay in good shape as you get older, your vital capacity and the maximum minute ventilation are going to decrease because the elasticity of your lungs decreases. The muscle mass decreases in your chest area. You're just going to have smaller breaths that are less deep. Your residual volume in the dead space are going to increase, so you just have air that's not getting exchanged with every breath. And the ability to remove mucus from the respiratory passageway decreases, and that mucus is going to, you're not going to be able to get rid of yucky stuff quite as fast. And then the gas exchange across membrane is reduced, so the actual membrane thickens, and you're not going to be able to get the gases across there quite as effectively. So that's going to happen when you age no matter what, but if you exercise, it counters those effects. So stay active. So back to Mr. Theron. He concluded that his left lung had collapsed. So do you think Mr. Theron had both lobes of his left lungs were just flat?
No.
So what is he saying when he says that his left lung collapsed when somebody tells you that?
It's just not getting adequate. There's not enough space.
Okay, and remember in emphysema, you've got the buildup of those non-elastic fibers, right? And so what has decreased as a result of what key vocab word has decreased? Starts with a C. We talked about it with blood vessels. Compliance, okay? So since he has emphysema, his lungs are less compliant. And he couldn't stop coughing. So if you're coughing, you're forcing the air out of your lungs, right? And then could some of his alveoli actually flatten? If he forced enough of that air out? And they're not compliant, right? So they're not going to be able to inflate properly. So he's got portions of his alveoli that have flattened, right? And they might all be in one particular lobule or one lobe of the lungs, or it might be scattered throughout, but it's not like his whole two left lobes of his lung are just smushed flat like a steamroller. Okay? How would that affect his breathing then, if some of his alveoli aren't inflating? It would probably increase his breathing rate, right?
His breaths would be more shallow.
His breaths would be more shallow and probably more rapid, because whatever is left in his lungs is going to have to make up for whatever portion isn't working, right? So he's going to have shallow, rapid breathing. And with a stethoscope, you can actually start listening around in the different lobules of the heart to figure out which part of the lung is more affected than others. So that's how he was able to detect. You're not going to hear that whooshing of air going in and out.